Welcome once again to the Circular Economy Show by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where we develop and promote the idea of a circular economy, engage key actors to make it happen, and mobilize system solutions at scale. My name is Laura.
And my name is Maya, and we'll be your host for today's episode. So today we're going to talk about exploring growth and the circular economy. It's clear that we need to go beyond the current traditional understanding of economic growth to achieve a circular economy that is both regenerative and distributive by design.
Indeed, Maya. Building a thriving and resilient economy will require a combination of new ways of thinking, transformative action from the public and from the private sector, and a new set of tools and metrics. Making the economics work is a key element of the transition towards a circular economy. Let us guide you through a set of conversations with the people that are challenging our current economic framework.
Our first guest today is Kate Rowett, the author of Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, and the co-author of the Donut Economics Action Lab. Let's catch up on a previous conversation that Laura had on Kate's vision of what a 21st century economics looks like.
For our audience who might not be so familiar with your framework, could you show us how it looks like? I think you have an image or something with you.
Yeah, I always have a donut on the stick nearby. So here's the donut, and I offer it as a compass for 21st century prosperity. So the idea is, imagine humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the middle of this picture. And that means the hole in the middle is a place where people don't have the essentials of life. They don't have the food, water, healthcare, housing, education, income, political voice, gender equality that every person has a claim to. We must leave no person in the world in the hole of this donut. Get everybody over the social foundation and into the green ring itself. That was even a 20th century ambition to meet the needs of all. But in the 21st century, we know more. We know that if we try to do this in a way that excessively and misuses Earth's resources, we push ourselves beyond this ecological ceiling. We start to break down the life-supporting systems of planet Earth on which all of our lives depend. And we cause climate breakdown, and we acidify the oceans. We create a hole in the ozone layer, catastrophic levels of biodiversity loss. And these are the 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists say are the life-supporting systems that make this planet the one habitable planet of life in the universe that we know of. So we'd be crazy to kick ourselves out. If you put those two together, the goal of getting into the donut is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. It's that simple. The question is, how do we get there? And I believe we need to create a regenerative and distributive economy to take us in that direction.
And something that caught my attention when I looked at your framework, Kate, was that in order to measure all these kind of indicators, you are measuring them using social and natural metrics. You are not using dollars or pounds to talk about them. And I don't know, surely some politicians and especially economists who are really obsessed with talking about monetary metrics would say that perhaps using one type of metric would be easier. Or why are you doing this? Why are you talking in this kind of metrics?
So it's a great question. I'd say that in the 20th century, when GDP was invented by a brilliant American economist called Simon Kuznets, he was asked to put a single dollar figure on the output of the US economy for the first time in the 1930s. And he did. But even he warned at the time that this number could scarcely be taken as a measure of the welfare of a nation. He knew that it left out the unpaid caring work of families. It left out the value of the community. And even though it told you what had been bought and sold, it didn't tell you what had been lost in the process. It priced timber, but not the loss of a forest. So Simon Kuznets himself knew that it shouldn't be used that way. But there's a real power that lies in a single number, which is why GDP became this focus of how much can you make your economy grow. It became the focus of the Cold War between the US and the USSR. Which ideology can turn out more stuff? And so our nations became addicted to pursuing growth, almost like a horse race. And that was a very 20th century pursuit without recognizing these planetary boundaries. When we recognize the economy needs to be within the ecosystems, then the idea of something that grows endlessly doesn't make sense. And so I think we need to start over again. And if Simon Kuznets were alive today, If he had today the data that's becoming available, we can measure the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. We can measure the acidity of the oceans. We can measure the health and the life expectancy of individuals. We can measure the nutrition, the education rates. We have phenomenal data available to us that his generation never did. I think he would be on the team of saying it's time to move away from this one number. We need a dashboard.
Where is the economy in your framework? What kind of thinking do economists in the 21st century need? Because in the diagram, we can see the planetary boundaries, the social foundations, but where are the economics?
Yeah, it's a really good question because an economist might say, well, I can't see the economy here. Where is it? And I very intentionally took away the normal indicators that we start with of the economy because I wanted to say, let's start with the fundamentals. Let's start with the fundamentals of human well-being. And these are drawn from the Sustainable Development Goals. So all the governments in the world have already agreed that all the people in the world have a claim to meeting these essential needs. And let's start with the fundamentals of planetary health. I mean, after all, economics means the art of household management. How the heck can you presume to manage the household if you don't even understand it? So let's understand this household, its planetary boundaries. Let's understand its people and their essential needs. Now we've put in place the fundamentals of economics. Now we can invite economic thinking and reasoning into the room and say, what kind of institutions, what balance between market, state, household, and commons, what kind of incentives and regulations will enable us to meet these goals? And the economy is here. I've written it here. It says regenerative and distributive economy. And the reason that's what I wrote is because I believe what we need to focus on is creating dynamics that start bringing us into the donut. Because right now we are way outside it on both sides. Billions of people fall short on their essential needs, and we're overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. And what that tells us is we have an economy that's deeply degenerative. We are running down the life-supporting systems of our planet. And we need to transform that degenerative dynamic into a regenerative dynamic where we work with and within the cycles of the living world. But we also have an economy that's deeply divisive, where the returns of value and opportunity are so often driven into the hands of a 1%. So we have billions of people who can't meet their essential needs and a doubling of number of billionaires in the world in the past decade. So we need to turn this divisive economic dynamics into distributive economic dynamics. So for me, the 21st century economy is absolutely in the donut. The question is, how are we going to make our economy regenerative? And how are we going to make it distributive? And that's the entry point. Now let's talk about economics in those terms. Let's reframe the starting point and let's dive in from there.
So important to talk about framing. And what I'm getting is that you basically are thinking about two main principles for the economy. So it has to be regenerative by design and distributive by design. And I think a lot of the work of what we do at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation overlaps here with the work that you do, because we want to have a regenerative economy. And I wanted to ask you, Kate, as part of this, what role do you think the circular economy plays in this?
I think it's key. So let me grab my favorite piece of hosepipe. This is our degenerative economy. It's the linear take, make, use, lose of industrial systems that we've inherited. And that linear degenerative process is what pushes us over planetary boundaries. It takes again and again from Earth's sources. It throws waste again and again into Earth's sinks. We have to turn this linear arrow into a circular one, right? We have to work with and within the cycles of the living world so that resources are never used up. They're used again and again, far more collectively, more creatively, and more carefully and more slowly. So I think a circular economy is a necessity in the search of becoming regenerative. We can't do it without reusing resources and recognizing that waste from one process is food for the next. How do we make that distributive at the same time? For me, that's the really interesting question. How do we make sure that the circular economy not only takes us towards regenerative design, it takes us towards distributive design? So, for example, I believe we need industries that make products that have the right to repair, that are modular by design, so that instead of individual companies having their own circular supply chain, send everything back to me and it's within my intellectual property rights and these are my materials and nobody else knows how I use them. And it's a kind of corporate loop. That is never going to work because nature doesn't do that. Nature doesn't create a series of 100 little loops. Nature creates an ecosystem, right? Nature puts resources back into the ecosystem, back as basic building blocks, and then starts again. So if we want to mimic nature in the way we create circular economies, we need an ecosystem of plastics use and an ecosystem of metals and an ecosystem of electronics and an ecosystem of ceramics. And that means that the materials need to be labeled and open source in their design. So anyone who ends up with a material in their hand knows what kind of material it is and is able to feed it back into the ecosystem. So I think it has really far-reaching implications for ensuring that we don't go down this corporate siloed circularity, but that we have a ecosystem circularity. And that requires a regulation and a collaboration between industries to make that ecosystem and to make those shared commons-based technologies and shared standards that everybody can connect to. But also, I would say that the circular economy has a huge potential to be an employment-creating, a job-creating, and a meaningful job-creating economy, right? There's creativity and joy and meaning in figuring out how to use Earth's resources again and again, how to repurpose them, what can they become next time. So it enables architects and engineers and designers to be innovative and to come up with new solutions. And those are the folks I meet who work in big companies who can't wait to get going, making these new designs.
For cities, I know you have 4 main lenses that you look at when you try to approach the donut framework. What are they, and why was it so important to incorporate as well the global perspective?
So here's the question that we invite any ambitious city, any city that wants to be fit for the 21st century, we invite it to ask itself, and I just would invite anybody listening to this to think of a city that they know and love and look at it through this lens. So here's the question. How can your city be a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? So that's a big question. And you can hear in it, there's both local aspiration to be thriving people, whatever it means to the people of your city. You know, what it means to thrive will be different to the people of Dar es Salaam as to the people of Stockholm. So let each culture and community bring their history, their meaning, their way of living and say, this is what it means to thrive here for us. And how are we doing against that? And then also part of the local aspiration, what does it mean for your city to be a part of a thriving place? Like every city on the planet is located in a different part of Earth's ecosystems. Some are mountains, some are in valleys, some are in the equator, some are in the Arctic Circle. And what nature's doing in those places varies. So nature has a genius, as Janine Benyus would say, of thriving different in each of these places. And we can learn from nature and aim for our cities to belong in that habitat. So let's say I'm in the city of Oxford in the UK, and the nearest natural habitat is a place called Whiteham Woods, just a couple of miles outside the city. I could go to Whiteham Woods and say, this is what nature's doing here. This is how nature thrives. And let's take the measurements of Whiteham Wood. Let's measure how much carbon dioxide these woods are sequestering, how much groundwater they're storing after a storm, how much biodiversity the woods are housing, how much the woods are cooling the air in the summer from the treetops to the forest floor. So we take the metrics of nature and we say, what would it mean for our city to aim to actually match or even exceed the generosity of the wildland next door? So that our cities would be functionally indistinct from the wildland in which they're embedded. As Janine would say, we humans come to truly belong in the landscapes in which we are nestled. So that's local aspiration, to be thriving people in a thriving place.
So, creating a regenerative circular economy requires us to look at nature, understanding how it works, and change how we measure success in the economy. Kate mentioned that in order to change the system, we need to change regulations and enable collaboration among the different players. On this topic, our next guest is Mariana Mazzucato, professor at University College London and author of the newly released Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. This conversation was part of our annual Summit 21 just a few weeks ago, where Mariana explored the key role of governments in setting the direction with their available economic tools and the need to redesign policies to be goal-oriented.
I think the problem is that it can't just be isolated companies or even, kind of one government here and there. It really has to go to the center of how we actually think about economic change. and societal change. And in fact, one of the things I've been trying to do over the years is trying to help governments redesign their policies. So it's less about kind of pet projects, whether it's around plastic or any sort of particular area. It's really about saying, what does it mean to actually design policy to be goal oriented, and less about kind of picking random sectors or even random types of technologies or types of firms, right? There's this obsession about small, medium enterprises. Instead of looking at a type of firm, type of technology, type of sector, what does it actually look like if you have goals that are ideally starting with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? There's 17 of them. Every country has signed up to them. There's 169 targets beneath them. But the problem is that if you just stop at the goals, they're quite broad, right? So, SDG 13, life underwater, clean oceans, what does it actually mean to turn that into a moonshot, right? Like a plastic-free ocean over a certain amount of time and get as many different sectors involved in the process. So whether that's, the chemical sector, social innovation, biotech, design, AI, marine, and so on, they have to actually work together. And that's what got us to the moon. I've just written a book called Mission Economy that, getting to the moon was not just about aerospace. It was lots of innovation in nutrition, materials, electronics. The whole software industry in some ways was a spillover of that. But the other thing is that government back then was much more confident, I find, and capable in some ways than many public institutions are today. And they really focused on how to work with business, how to actually design what I call a symbiotic mutualistic public-private partnership, and not what we see in some areas like health, where sometimes we have parasitic public-private partnerships. So what does it mean to actually design the contracts themselves to be outcomes-oriented? The state, I really do think, at least in democratic societies, has the duty to actually set the direction for change, but then leave very open the how. Right? You can't micromanage that process, but really setting a goal, again, plastic-free ocean, carbon neutral city, but also ones around inequality. And then using the full lever that government has, procurement contracts. And procurement is a huge possible innovation tool. So procurement, grants, loans, prize schemes to crowd in as many bottom-up solutions as possible. Yeah, pre-distribution. So we can't just create a mess in business and then expect other governments or philanthropies, which are really big nowadays. Think of all the big philanthropies, whether it's the Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, lots of really great foundations doing good things. But what would it look like if we actually got the right business models, the right type of policies in the first place? There would probably be less need actually for the philanthropies, but also less need for redistributive policies, which unfortunately take up a lot of the kind of brain space of governments. They should really be thinking together with business on how to create better value, not just pick up the mess afterwards when we create all this inequality or problems in the environment. Well, I think if we think of the circular economy not just as something peripheral to the economy that then the treasuries, the ministries of finance, and CEOs can talk about, but at the center of how we direct the economy and how we also build the economic models themselves of how we understand growth processes, then that's where we're going to have change. And unfortunately, so far, I think a lot of the people advocating for the circular economy haven't necessarily gotten their hands dirty enough in terms of the economics of it. And so I think that's a real opportunity. But what does that actually then mean for how we construct, GDP indices that are much better than they currently are, but also in terms of valuing what has been done? And you'll know that everything government does, whether it's public education, public health, public transport, or their energy programs, get evaluated. Often those evaluation metrics are really static. They're based on kind of cost-benefit analysis, net present value calculations. And I think we do need to ask ourselves, what are the implications of having this kind of mission-oriented approach that I talk about, James's point about actually, focusing on the goals, working together to achieve them, and welcoming all the spillovers that might happen along the way across the entire economy for how we then evaluate how well we're doing. And we have to get out of these static frameworks and linear frameworks and really kind of welcome the serendipity actually that might also happen along the way. But it has to be economy-wide, intersectoral, and interactor.
If you'd like to watch the full conversation, our Summit 21 is available on catch-up on our website. So now, for the past 25 years, the European Environment Agency under the European Union has been actively monitoring data from a number of member states on a whole variety of both environmental and climate policies in Europe. These policies include things like water, air quality, biodiversity, and circular economy. Up next, we're going to hear more from the Executive Director, Hans Brunswick, in conversation with Joss Bleriot, the head of the institutions, governments, and cities team at the foundation.
In January, the agency published a paper called Growth Without Economic Growth, which for an official European agency might be construed as a bit provocative. So I have two questions on that. What was the goal and how it's been received?
Well, I think the goal was to create, from a public agency's perspective, a space where we can, in fact, discuss, have a dialogue about what the true meaning is of the vision behind the 8th Environment Action Programme, and also in the European Green Deal, which states that we should live well within the limits of the planet. And the European Green Deal starts with a sentence that says that we are dealing with existential threats. Now, it would be a little bit bizarre to come out of this situation without fundamentally discussing our economy, the growth model that we've had for decades, if not a couple hundred years, where production and consumption systems are fundamentally unsustainable. So what we wanted to do is put on the table this fundamental debate of, how do we grow in a very different way? How do we grow without being hooked to the traditional understanding of economic growth that is monitored in essence by GDP growth, and GDP growth only almost, that we've been on for decades, because we know that is fundamentally unsustainable.
In that discussion around the system change and how the drivers of the economic model need to be reformed, there's always a tendency to look for what needs to happen next, what we need to do, what new measures, new mechanisms, new governance model, etc., new incentives need to be put on the table. But you also make really interesting points about what we should stop doing, and not only focus about adding more things, but also looking at trimming the things that are not conducive to what we want to do.
Yeah, I do think indeed that is a critical part of the discussion about these fundamental sustainability transitions that we need. The intrinsic optimistic curve is, of course, that we reflect on how we can experiment with new methods, new technologies, new economic approaches and models, and then we scale them up and we speed them up, and we are in a better place if we manage to do that. But I think it's equally important that we reflect on what we should stop doing. And there has been a lot written about that, but the debate about that is not very well structured and not always very effectively translated in action. And that means we should stop the burning of fossil fuels as soon as we can. We should stop with tax and fiscal systems that are not conducive to sustainability. We know that there has been a long-standing debate in the OECD, but also in UNEP and of course in the European Union about environmentally harmful subsidies that we should phase out very quickly now in many cases. We should stop, I think, with the type of resource use and the type of design of products that leads to early obsolescence, or that leads to our inability to repair them or to refurbish them or to recycle the materials into the economic cycle. But we should also reflect on consumption. You could have an argument about stopping certain forms of, you could say, junk consumption. We know that a lot of products are produced almost not to last and not to have any serious contribution to our well-being or to anything that seems sustainable over the long term. So there is a lot of things that I think we should phase out and stop doing. And if we would more explicitly embed that in our policies, I think we create more space for the speeding up and scaling up of the good practices. And again, this requires policies. This requires market conditions that drive this phasing out. And in some cases, it might even require strong compliance mechanisms, which we have on the side of the, what we should start doing. Maybe we should do that also more on the side of what we should stop doing.
And of course, as you say, these are this call for deep structural reforms, because you can't decree that all of a sudden we just stop doing that, but the policies that drive that favor throughput, that favor consumption remain in place, because that's never going to happen. So it is, in a way, a very long, potentially very long discussion to be had. It's possibly also quite divisive, and we see that debates are quite contested on that front. So how, in your opinion...
If I may, Jos, we see positive steps there. And the bold move by the European Investment Bank to step out of investments in fossil fuels was a clear signal, I think, in that direction. And that's important to get that signal. The bold move of some countries to really start phasing out certain subsidies, I think is the right direction. The idea in the discussion about sustainable finance to not only have a sustainable taxonomy, but also a brown taxonomy. I mean, just the fact that in the European institutions, we are now discussing that as an option is really a rather fundamental breakthrough in public institutions. We know that academics and pressure groups have been preaching this language and also bringing the scientific underpinnings for it and the empirical evidence of why we should be doing that. But I'm really encouraged by the fact that we see this happening now in public debates. And I think the point that you made is crucial. You cannot just take all these subsidies out of the economy by tomorrow. But what you could do in a European model, which is a mixed economic model, is you can say, yes, we will keep public money in the economy, but over a period of 5-10 years, we will fundamentally shift the direction of this money in the direction of sustainability. And the key categories that we should use as a litmus test are rather clear. Does it contribute to the further decarbonization? Does it contribute to a more circular economy and resource efficiency? Is it at least not a threat to further biodiversity degradation, but rather strengthens that? And does it contribute to human health and well-being? So diverting and shifting rather clearly with a clear needle on the compass, which gives certainty to investors, to cities, to public institutions as to the direction and the timing, I think is clearly the way to go there.
So Hans highlighted the importance of challenging the way our economy fundamentally works and grows. And not only think about what we have to do differently, but also about the harmful practices we should stop doing. He has also spoken about the momentum around the circular economy in Europe, which was also explored by our final guest today, right, Maya?
Yes, Laura. Our last guest is Dimitri Mariasin, the Deputy Executive Secretary at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, or UNECE. Dimitri spoke with Jos about the transformations happening in the policy space in Europe and the importance of recognizing that a circular economy requires an economic transformation.
Dimitri, thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. And to get us started, maybe if I could ask you to give a bit of context with regards to the UN's Economic Commission for Europe. What's its mission, member states, its remit?
Thank you. UN Economic Commission for Europe has been around since 1947. It's one of the 5 regional commissions of the United Nations. And as such, it's responsible for regional cooperation and norm setting in a number of areas in 56 member states, stretching from Canada to Tajikistan. So we're covering both the Western European countries, US and Canada, as well as the countries of the former Soviet Union, former Yugoslavia, and Turkey. So it's a very wide range of countries. When we're talking about the themes, we work on energy, environment, sustainable cities, very importantly on transport, on statistics, trade to a great extent, economic integration, innovation issues, and so on. And in each of these, UNECE is a platform which brings the member states together, and not just to discuss things, but actually issue normative guidance. We are hosting dozens and dozens of conventions, protocols, and other standard-setting frameworks that affect people's lives in the region and beyond. What we've also discovered preparing for the Commission session is that there is clearly a need to have more circular approaches. Globally, demand for materials is growing, underpinned by both economic and population growth. We have seen, however, that in our region, which is very heterogeneous, so that's an important but efficiency in the use of resources has increased overall by around 10% in the past 15, 20 years. However, the material footprint, which takes into account also the raw materials used in imported goods, has continued to grow. And we see that typically, countries with higher income levels tend to have larger material footprints. But in our region, it's also very clear that per capita use of material resources across the region does reflect differences in living standards. So in our region, we see two stories. One of the more developed countries, such as the European Union member states, and another is of the eastern part of the region, where we can see material consumption per capita is increasingly growing in the middle and low income countries in the east of the region. So this is the overall big picture set of trends that has led us to believe that circularity is something to look at. Then we're seeing significant momentum for talking about this. We believe that the post-COVID-19 recovery is indeed a unique point where many economies around the world can choose a different model. So with the investment flowing in rethinking the economies, in rethinking the labor market, in rethinking how technology influences how we produce, we think this is the moment to talk about circularity. And we also believe that more circular, more sustainable approaches can influence the way trade evolves, also coming out of the COVID crisis. Finally, what we had heard already before the Commission session, and what we definitely heard very strongly during our main event of the year, was a very strong demand from the countries of the region for more circular approaches and for more sustainable use of natural resources, and a demand for frameworks, for measurement, for best practices, for practical approaches, and for sharing knowledge on these topics. And I'll be happy to say a bit more about specifically what we're seeing from the point of view of our countries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The diversity of countries and economies that you deal with must be a bit of a challenge, and at the same time, that's what it makes it so interesting, because you go from a fragmented approach to a unified vision around common goals, and circular economy is certainly a really compelling story on that front. I'm guessing that for some of these countries, the most pressing issue has been recently the energy transition and how they fuel their economy moving to low carbon. How can moving from that topic to more specifically consumption and production, so SDG 12, which is at the heart of circular economy, how does that play out? And do you see a lot of appetite for those countries to develop their own national roadmaps and legislation?
Yes, correct. Indeed, you're absolutely right. We had about 45 ministers from our countries making a statement in the Commission session. We've asked all of them not to just make a general statement of how supportive they are of our work, but rather to focus on what national commitments for circular economy and sustainable use of natural resources are. And we've heard a number of extremely interesting examples of where countries are taking firm commitments. For example, as you're rightly mentioning, on the energy transition, many mentioned renewable energy. Many spoke about waste management. And then there were a few countries that are really trying to position themselves, ahead of the curve when it comes to applying circular economy thinking to a broader set of sectors. Of course, there is the European Union, and the member states of the European Union have committed to fairly ambitious targets as part of their roadmap for circular economy and as part of the Green Deal. But let me give you a few examples from the east of the region, which is typically outside of the radar. And just to mention a few examples. So Belarus is actually mentioning very specifically the focus on circularity, on, for example, reuse of materials, of production of goods from secondary raw materials in its strategy of sustainable development until 2035. It also has passed a decree on a phased reduction in the use of polymer packaging, which is a very important step to take for post-Soviet economy. Georgia has introduced extended producer responsibility in the National Waste Management Code and is now moving to more advanced forms of policy making in this sphere. Kazakhstan specifically focuses on circular economy in one of the main pillars of the strategic plan for development until 2025. Serbia, arguably really quite ahead in this sense, is building a national circular economy platform and has also launched a circular economy package funded by the European Union already back in April 2018, initially starting from waste and then moving to other sectors. So we're seeing great appetite for creating a new generation of national policy frameworks. In fact, several countries have specifically requested the UN Economic Commission for Europe to support them with development of circularity strategies. Many see it as part of their new growth paradigm and as part of their repositioning on the market.
Yes, and one thing that we see as maybe a broadening of the scope is, first of all, the circular economy discussion goes, as you've just shown, beyond the usual suspects of the European Union and the Scandinavians within that and China on the other side, but is really getting more traction from different countries. It's also moving from its natural habitat of Ministry of Environment into the hardcore economic sphere. And as part of this, there's more focus on the upstream measures. So moving away from resource management, strictly speaking, but also sourcing, procurement, and what we put on the system, that notion of feedstock as well, which is critical because, of course, if you put the right things in circulation, then the need to clean them up afterwards reduces greatly, and that has an implication on cost and also on the environmental performance. So how do these questions pan out when it comes to the recovery post-COVID specifically, and the recovery packages with the unprecedented funding that has been allocated to that? How does the circular economy play in that specific equation?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Interestingly, about half of the ministers that spoke at our commission session, and the countries did have a choice of which minister would represent them, were not environment ministers, were ministers of economy or innovation. And we think it's a very important trend that circular economy is becoming a theme for the economic part of the government. There was also a very interesting discussion about the private sector role in promoting circular economy, because it is clear that the circular economy transition requires businesses and consumers, of course, to be innovative, to find and adopt new ways of thinking, making, distributing, using, and disposing of goods, which means the governments can and in our view should take a step to really come out with new policies that would promote that. And this is precisely where the link to the post-COVID recovery comes in. With massive investment in business support, we believe there is, a strong need for the government to think of ways to use that stimulus to help their economies, including their small and medium enterprises, come to a new level and embrace some of these new ways of designing, making, distributing, using, and disposing of goods. We also believe that this is an opportunity for a whole new services sector to emerge, where a lot of the circularity approaches can be underpinned by digital technology, and where startups and bigger enterprises from around the world, from developed and developing countries alike, can actually leapfrog and help create completely new business models that would be good business, that would be environmentally sound, would be underpinned by circularity principles, and would use the digital technology as the basis. Again, can the governments use some of the stimulus spending to promote that kind of innovation? And then finally, well, we really hope that some of the sectoral approaches we have been working on here at UNICE, and that we can also promote, share knowledge about, such as in the textile sector, can actually be useful for governments as an inspiration on what else they could be doing when it comes to investing in the smarter recovery. So in that sense, I'm quite optimistic that we have a good degree of momentum. We are increasingly seeing recognition that circular economy is not about environment, it's about the economy. And we also just seeing the pressure from the private sector to look at these things as well.
So the circular economy has gained momentum in Europe and beyond, but putting forward the necessary transformations to take the circular economy to the next level requires that we take bold actions, change the goals, change the metrics, look beyond GDP, and bring the public and the private sector together. Unfortunately, that's all we had time for today. But
we'll be back in 2 weeks. We broadcast live every 2 weeks at the same time and same place, 3 p.m. UK time on Tuesdays. All the information about the upcoming episodes are on the website. And the best way to stay up to date with our content is to subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on LinkedIn or Facebook to get notified every time we go live. You can also subscribe to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's newsletter to stay up to date with other content and things happening in the circular economy world. Thanks, Laura. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, please do like this video or share it with your network. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.